Okay. Not a bad turnout for the first day after the Bayram. Does anyone care about anything other than exam scores here? I mean, does anyone want to learn about history, or is it just, exam scores? Listen, I understand you want your exam scores. I'm doing my best. I haven't finished them. There are 43 exams, okay? It's a lot to grade. I have 85 students. I've been out of the country for most of the last 10 days. I had to come back from Los Angeles. I left Los Angeles, I know it's tough, but I left Los Angeles at 5 a.m. on Sunday, and I got back yesterday. So you can imagine I'm a little exhausted from my trip. I'm doing my best. I've graded maybe 30 exams. Those of you who were kind enough to attend class the week after the midterm already know your exam scores. The rest of you will have to wait until Friday, unless, that is, you were clever or lucky enough to cop a peek at the scores. Really, I could give scores to those who I've graded, but it's unfair to those whose exams I have not graded. And so please do come Friday. Okay, now we're going to ease back into the subject today. We have a couple of things to cover. Loosely speaking, the first half of the lecture I'm going to talk mostly about Napoleon III and the French. Let's try to listen. If there's a question about something I've written, please ask. Is there a question?
Yes, first time as tragedy?
First time as tragedy, second as farce. This is a famous aphorism of Karl Marx, which relates to the events I'm going to talk about. So if we look here, let's try to listen. Again, the first half of the lecture, I'm going to talk mostly about the French and Napoleon III. And the second half, we're going to cover Bismarck, Prussia, and the rise of Germany. In some ways, the themes all come together. They were kind of, they were antagonists in a way, although early on, they weren't necessarily averse to working with one another. In fact, ironically, Bismarck, who will later be the one who essentially destroys Napoleon III and humiliates France, part of his innovation in the 1850s was actually that he was willing to work with France. But before we get to Bismarck, we have to go back a little bit into French history, because at least in the 1850s up to the Crimean War and the Italian War of Unification, France is, in a sense, the leading power, at least the power which is still influencing events the most, even if not necessarily the most powerful country in Europe. Remember that France had recovered, in many ways, probably more than it deserved to, after the wars of Napoleon, restoring the borders of 1789, the status quo ante, even really going back and almost restoring the old regime, the Bourbons. I've included here what I hope is kind of a useful list of French governments. The French go through governments so frequently that they have different ways of referring to them. In fact, I think modern French people probably remember most of these governments in terms of furniture and art. Like you say, this armoire was a Second Empire. This one was not necessarily First Republic, because that didn't last very long. But you'd refer to something as a Second Republic or a Second Empire or a Third Republic item. You can see they've gone through a lot. We remember the Bourbons going back to Henry IV, Paris's worth of mass, religious toleration. Then the golden era of kind of absolutism under the Sun King. Finally, of course, the Revolution, which technically did not really end the Bourbon monarchy. For a couple of years, remember, Louis XVI was still on the throne. Then you had the First Republic, the kind of Second French Revolution, year zero, the metric system, all the rest, the Terror, the National Convention. Now, I put a couple of dates here because, again, depending on how pedantic or semantic you want to be, you could say that Napoleon really became dictator in 1799, even though he didn't declare himself emperor until 1804. So that the First Republic you could date either for these 7 years or maybe these 12 years. Technically, 12 years might make more sense because that is the length of time they used the new calendar for, with all of the new months and so on. Then, of course, you had the First Empire, or you might just call it simply the Napoleonic era, the high Napoleonic era, until, I suppose, again, you could date it to 1814, when they lost the wars and they inaugurated the Congress of Vienna, except remember there was also the 100 Days in 1815. So to simplify things, you could say right up to 1815. Then you have about 15 years of a restoration of the old regime. Again, to set back the clock. That was the reason France got a pretty good deal, got its old borders. France was not completely truncated or occupied in any permanent way. But this, of course, then is torn asunder in the July Revolution of 1830, leading to the so-called July, or it's sometimes called the bourgeois, or the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe, who was kind of a progressive in some ways, but the restrictions on the voting franchise were still very severe. Sometimes people call this almost a government by oligarchy, that is, by the wealthy merchant classes along with the aristocrats who had recovered their positions somewhat. Now this gives way to a new phase of revolutions which begins in Paris in 1848. Again, the dates are a little imprecise. Technically, you could say the Second Republic lasts until about December of 1851, when this kind of coup d'etat is staged by Napoleon III. And then this leads to the government we refer to as the Second Empire, that of Napoleon III, between roughly 1852 and 1870. The Third Republic, confusingly, is usually dated to 1877 when its constitution was inaugurated. But really, it kind of followed the fall of Napoleon III. Okay, well, so those are the dates. That's the basic kind of architecture of French governance, at least in the 19th century. There are a lot of interesting political questions to do with the revolution and its legitimacy. You know, in a way, France never completely squared this circle. I mean, even today, there are loyalists to the old monarchy. Not that many of them. The monarchy, which really has not existed since the 19th century. There are some loyalists who would like to bring back at least some version of the Bourbons. There aren't that many people who would like to bring back the Napoleonic dynasty. But the real, I think, interesting debate, which we'll look at when we look at the Third Republic, the one which maybe for the purposes of Turkey's own history is the most interesting, is the debate between what are usually called, you might call it sort of the Catholic conservative establishment and the anti-clericals. That is, the radicals who looked back to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, who wanted to essentially deny the power of the church, particularly in education. That doesn't really emerge as a major conflict, social conflict, until the Third Republic, although there are elements of it in all of these different periods. Today we're mostly going to talk about foreign policy, though, particularly how Napoleon III interacted with Europe. Although there's an interesting point Kissinger makes about Napoleon III, which is that it's curious that foreign policy was his passion because he was no good at it. Usually people are passionate about something they're good at. Whereas in a curious way, you could say that domestically he actually was not really that bad of a ruler. I mean, there's some controversy about some of his policies. He certainly wasn't a liberal. I mean, he wasn't a terrible dictator, but I mean, he did have a lot of people arrested and killed. The coup d'etat, which leads to him being proclaimed emperor in December 1851, this is what Marx was referring to in his famous book called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. 18th Brumaire being the date the first Napoleon had staged his kind of cynical coup d'etat, you know, where he surrounded the parliament and accused everyone of being English spies. Now, Napoleon III, you don't always see this in the textbooks, but it was fairly brutal. I wrote down here the number of people killed on the streets. There was significant gunfire on the Boulevard des Italiens in Paris during the coup d'etat of December 1851. I think about 1,000 rebels were killed, or at least severely wounded. Dozens of bystanders were hit in the crossfire. This, interestingly, plays a role in some of his domestic policies. The thing most people, like if you go to visit Paris and you read the tourist guidebooks, has anyone been to Paris? Yeah. Well, do you remember anything about the construction of the Grand Boulevard, as they're called, you know, the great, like, you know, the Champs-Élysées, the Rue de Rivoli. This dates to this era. The Baron Haussmann was the great kind of architect who redesigned Paris under Napoleon III. And the design was, in fact, partly cynical. It was to open up broad boulevards so that the government would have a clear field of fire in case of, again, revolution. It's sort of like an innovation. You remember the first Napoleon had kind of made his name with the whiff of grape shot by firing into the mob. His nephew, had a slightly different and you might say more elaborate policy of crowd control, which was to knock down old apartment blocks to broaden out the streets and boulevards, have kind of great public works projects. I mean, a lot of people like it. They think Paris is grand. Everyone loves the Champs-Élysées. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people do. Other people say he ruined the character of medieval Paris, by breaking out all of the streets. There was definitely an element of cynicism involved, however. Interestingly, his election in the first place, I mean, he was elected democratically. He was elected president by a legitimate vote, more or less. This, incidentally, is one of the things which gave, I'm just going to close the door, which gave Marx his idea about particularly what he called the kind of superstition and almost stupidity of the peasant classes. It was the peasants who voted Napoleon III into power, despite the fact that, essentially he had never really lived in France before. He had spent most of his life living in Italy in exile, hanging out with these kind of romantic Carbonari rebels, the same who he would later help to win Italian independence. Again, ironically, because the first Napoleon, too, had been from Corsica, so neither of them are really even from France. French is not really even his first language. Well, anyway, the reason Marx was so cynical about it, and he developed all these aphorisms, first time is tragedy, second is farce. Well, it's true. I mean, they voted for him based on name recognition. I mean, there really was no other logical reason to vote this man president. It's true he didn't have a lot of competition. The most interesting, actually, of his opponents was a man called Alphonse de Lamartine, who had emerged in the earlier days of the Revolution of 1848. There was yet another period of kind of street riots. They call them the June days. They always name it after the month in which it happens, where he actually emerged as the first head of the kind of provisional revolutionary government. What's fun about Lamartine to me is that he was a historian. So basically, he had just finished writing a book about the French Revolution, and then France had another revolution, and he emerged as the leader of the new French Revolution. Only in France could this kind of thing happen, with an intellectual nearly running the government. That said, while he was influential in the kind of Republican phase of the revolution, he had no chance against Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, because he wasn't named Napoleon. And that's pretty much what the vote came down to. Napoleon III was elected president because he was named Napoleon. Obviously, there was a lot of nostalgia for the kind of glory days. I mean, that really is probably the best way of explaining it. Yes, there were economic factors, and Marx talked about those too. A lot of peasants had done sort of better in the days of Napoleon than they probably had done under the Restoration for various reasons. There had been a little bit more social mobility in the Napoleonic era. But for the most part, I think it was just nostalgia for better times. There was the kind of legend of Napoleon. Again, some of it deliberately cultivated by the French government, who very easily could have repudiated Napoleon. I mean, kind of like what the Germans obviously did with the Nazis and Hitler after World War II. Admittedly, Hitler was a great degree kind of more evil than Napoleon, but you could have imagined the French would have wanted to dissociate themselves from a man who, after all, had killed probably more Frenchmen than anyone in history in all of his wars of aggression. Instead, the French more or less embraced him as a hero, and this helped pave the way for a new restoration, you might call it, of Napoleon III. So they have the cynical kind of coup d'etat. He arrests his opponents, several thousand. There's more violence in the streets. Eventually they broaden the boulevards. But that said, his domestic policies, again, they weren't terrible. France's economy did pretty well. A lot of kind of like the glorious age of modern French architecture and even sculpture and that sort of thing. He definitely supported manufacturing. The government established various credit and lending institutions. Domestically, his rule was by no means kind of despicable. He was certainly not a democrat. He was definitely an autocrat. But that said, it is a little strange again. He did have some knack for at least domestic governance. He had no skill at all in foreign policy. But that was his passion. Now, in a way, that's probably inevitable. I mean, after all, the man is the nephew of the great Napoleon. And he is now the Emperor of France. So that he is going to try, if nothing else, to kind of make his mark on the scene. Now, he had a couple of ideas. They were a little vague. As I said, he didn't have a whole lot of actual skill or aptitude for foreign policy. He wanted to restore the greatness of France, probably his own glory, etc. He wasn't entirely sure how to do it, but he had a couple of rather vague ideas. One was that Napoleon I, his uncle's greatest kind of mistake, was to have antagonized Britain. He thought, well, look, there's no natural reason we have to be enemies with Britain. Britain, after all, controls the seas. There's probably nothing we can do about that. Our real enemy, as kind of progressive Frenchmen, standing for some notion of modernism or nationalism or something like that, our real enemy is the old establishment represented by Austria, and if you remember, Metternich, right? The Metternich system. This system which was designed supposedly to shackle France. I mean, even if, frankly, France didn't do so badly at the Congress of Vienna, still, it was not to be denied that the whole Vienna system was designed to contain France. That, after all, was what the Quadruple Alliance was: Prussia, Austria, Russia, Britain. That's what the Holy Alliance was. Remember, the alliance of the kind of conservative Christian Eastern emperors: Austria, Prussia, Russia. The idea was, again, to suppress any sign of revolutionary sentiment, liberalism, nationalism, etc. Now, even though, again, in practice, Napoleon III is no Democrat, I mean, he just arrested his opponents and so on. Remember, there's always an element of humbug with these things. I mean, remember, the first Napoleon had fancied himself the great liberal reformer, right? The Code Napoleon, new civil code, we are out to destroy feudalism, we're liberating you from your chains. France, in this view, stands for modernity, progress, social reform, some variety of popular sovereignty, again, however kind of cynically contrived. But the idea is they stand for what is new and progressive and modern. Whereas Metternich, the Austrians and the Russians, they stand for reaction. So Napoleon is thinking to himself, well, look, in that sense, maybe we should not have antagonized Britain. That was maybe the biggest mistake of my uncle. Because after all, the British, they kind of too stood for modernity. I mean, they had a parliamentary system of governance. They were very advanced commercially. Maybe in some ways we in France and the British, we're not that far apart. And it's true, Britain had always been aloof from the kind of ideological part of the Metternich alliance. They believed in the balance of power, yes, but they didn't believe in suppressing revolution wherever it arose. The British were not like that. They really weren't part of this kind of conservative, Catholic, or Orthodox establishment of Europe. They were a predominantly Protestant country that had a fairly liberal political system. And so Napoleon, again, part of it is just he's like a man of fashion. So the modern fashion, if you're young, you're ambitious, you're idealistic, the modern fashion is for some variety of liberalism, nationalism, democracy, what have you. Remember that although today we tend to associate the idea of nationalism, I suppose, more with the right, that is, with a kind of patriotism, possibly a reaction, or at the very least, the idea of like a strong foreign policy, maybe even a belligerent one. In the 19th century, it was very much the opposite. The system, the Metternich system, remember, stood for legitimacy, not nationalism. In fact, it was very much, the essence of it was to repudiate nationalism in whatever form. You remember, to withhold the sovereignty of, let's say, monarchs, even over multi-ethnic empires like the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, also multi-ethnic. The Ottoman Empire may be the example sine qua non of a multi-ethnic empire. Again, to uphold these kinds of empires, that was the conservative principle. Not because multiculturalism was good. No, simply because legitimacy and tradition was good. Because preserving the status quo was good. Because allowing nationalism to wreak its fury and possibly destroy these empires, that was dangerous. So nationalism, those who supported it, tended to be on the left. That is to say, they wanted to change things. They wanted to break apart the Ottoman Empire, to support, as they called it, freedom fighters or movements like the Greeks or the Serbs, or later on, possibly even the Arabs. But the idea is to support the national cause. The same thing in Austria. Remember, Austria now rules over northern Italy again after the first Napoleon had been expelled. So Austria stands for order, but also kind of empire. You have a whole Italian national movement, which Napoleon III had actually been personally involved in during his years in exile. So the nationalists, they're kind of on the left. Now again, Napoleon III, again, when it comes to domestic practice, he's hardly liberal. He's the emperor, right? He's not exactly someone who believes in, shall we say, great differences of opinion. The press is not completely state-controlled, but in France, it is very much, it's not going to criticize Napoleon III. Let's put it that way. That said, he and his idea of France still is very much that it's kind of this progressive power that is supposed to kind of be on the side of progress, on the side of nationalism. He's not quite sure what he wants to do with this yet. But he knows that whatever the Metternich system is, the kind of balance of power, concert of Europe, Holy Alliance, all of this stuff he despises. All of it is the antithesis of whatever it is that France is and France wants. That's the way he thinks. So there are a couple of ways he could consider going about either ruining this system, ruining the alliance. Basically, he just wants to kind of muck things up. You could almost think of his foreign policy as one of kind of like seeking entertainment. I mean, he just wants change for its own sake. He thinks that no matter what kind of change happens, it will benefit France because France will be seen as essentially the creator or the agent, the catalyst of change. France will represent change. France will yet again be like it was under the first Napoleon, the mover, the shaker, the leader of Europe. It's not necessarily all that much more complicated than that. Now, it could have started anywhere. It could have started in Italy. As it turned out, instead it started in the Ottoman Empire, oddly enough, of all places. It's true that France did have, if we remember going back to the days of the Bourbons, the days of the kind of wars with Austria, France did have something of a pseudo-alliance with the Ottoman Empire. But that had been kind of broken up, if you remember, in the French Revolution. Particularly with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, but even before then, I mean, simply when they executed Louis XVI, they ended the old regime, which had this relationship with the Ottoman Empire. I mean, in a way, that's true of any monarchy. When you kill the monarch and end the monarchy, you also end all of the old agreements in foreign policy. So France's old relationship with the Ottomans had been really ruptured in the period of the Revolution and the Napoleonic period. It's true that France, well, they hadn't helped matters by kind of quietly and then openly supporting the Greeks in the 1820s, at the Battle of Navarino. So certainly there was no reason to suspect that France had any great attachment to the Ottoman Empire. France, again, if it stood for anything, it stood for these ideas of kind of liberal reform, modernization, etc. Partly for that reason, though, there was, at least by a later time, a possible grounds for a renewed French-Ottoman alliance, in the same way there was for a renewed British-French alliance. I mean, if you look at, I didn't write all the Ottoman stuff up here, but if you look at the era usually we refer to as the Tanzimat, now it can be dated variously to different periods. Some people date it something like this, 1839 to 1856. You could also date it really right up, I would say, to the 1870s or maybe 1871, the kind of classic High Tanzimat era. Now, what this had to do with, obviously to some extent it is liberal reforms, certain notions of the equality between the different millets, particularly that for Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire. There are a lot of different ways of looking at it. You could look at it simply in terms of internal Ottoman history. You can look at it in terms of Mahmud II, going back to the Janissary Rebellion of 1826. But some of it also simply had to do with European diplomacy, with courting the Western liberal powers, particularly Britain and France. The notion that is that by reforming in this direction, the Ottomans, particularly in the era of Mahmud II and then even more Abdulmejid, they would essentially, I suppose you might say, they would preempt the argument. By modernizing, they would preemptively cut the Europeans off from any excuse to intervene. That was the idea. And the timing is interesting because, the two principal reforms, 1839, you have, we usually call it either the Rose Chamber Edict or the Rescript of the Rose Bower. This was issued after and particularly right after, you call him, I know, Kavalala Mehmet Ali had yet again defeated the Ottomans. So it's kind of a time of weakness. It's kind of a signal to the European powers, don't let us go under. This is the first time they kind of proclaim this principle of, either liberalism or at the very least religious equality. We'll call this the Rose Edict or the Rose Chamber Edict. And then there was the Firman of 1856, which was actually issued essentially in between the end of the Crimean War and the Paris Conference, which formally ended it. And this is the one where they went a little further in proclaiming religious equality. They also ended the old, at least formally, they ended the jizya, or the poll tax, which actually is right in the Quran. They didn't really end it. They kind of ended it in the spirit, I suppose in the letter, but not the spirit, because what they did instead is they had a new tax that minorities would pay in order to exempt themselves from military service. But again, both of these and the whole era, the Tanzimat reform, how sincere the reforms were, how much they were just cosmetically designed to Europe. It coincides with, however, again, you want to define it, a liberal era in the Ottoman Empire, at least a publicly proclaimed liberal era, when the influence really of the Western European embassies, particularly those of Britain and France, were paramount in Constantinople and Istanbul, particularly embodied in the person of Stratford Canning de Redcliffe. He was the British ambassador that, to a certain extent, was even considered the most powerful man in the city, where literally his word was said to be enough to secure the dismissal or the placing in office of Ottoman ministers. So if you put this together with European politics, then you get a couple of interesting things. On the one hand, the Ottomans, for maybe the first time, and not necessarily the only time, but definitely the first time in the kind of era of their decline, are suddenly a cause. That is, they're a cause of the left. Again, which is kind of a reversal. The traditional reputation, the terrible Turks and all of that. European propaganda against the Ottoman Empire, suddenly they're more like they're a fashionable cause. Now, this coincides with a couple of other things which reinforce this impression. The revolutions in Europe in 1848 had spread beyond Paris. In the German states, that is the German Confederation, the Frankfurt Parliament had essentially, they issued a constitution and they said, we will now unify Germany under the auspices of Prussian leadership. They literally offer the crown of a unified German empire to Friedrich Wilhelm IV. He famously says, no thanks. Yeah, I don't want the crown, as he put it, from the gutter, which is to say, from the Democrats, from a parliament. Now, some of this can be blamed on Bismarck, who was against the idea. We'll talk about Bismarck in the second half of the lecture. Some can possibly be blamed on the Tsar, Nicholas I, as part of his kind of, again, this conservative alliance. He definitely told Frederick Wilhelm IV not to take the crown. This advice was then actually backed up by force, because rebellion has also spread to the Habsburg Empire. The Hungarians are rising up demanding independence. The Poles are rising up against both the Habsburgs and the Russians demanding independence. The Italians, again, are rising up against the Habsburgs. Now, what happens basically is that the Austrians are kind of preoccupied with the Italian rebellion, which leaves them vulnerable to both the Hungarians and the Poles. And so Nicholas I sends troops to suppress these rebellions. That is, the Russians literally send troops to suppress rebellions against the Habsburg Emperor. We should keep that in our mind. That's very important, because this is, in a way, the embodiment of the whole principle of the Metternich system. The emperors are all aiding one another. That is, the interests are seen as not like Austria has its interest and Russia has its interest. Right? The idea is rather they both have the same interest. The same interest in suppressing revolution, in suppressing nationalism. Nicholas I, the Russian emperor, he's kind of the greatest, you might say, exponent. You might even call him like the enforcer. He's the one who enforces this principle, this system. He's the one who suppresses the rebellions, or at least who helps the Austrians suppress the rebellions. So he and the Austrians, but particularly Russia, they stand for, again, the establishment. The principle of conservatism, legitimacy, which will be backed up by force. And the Prussians, too, even though they didn't send troops, because they specifically repudiated the Frankfurt Parliament. I mean, kind of shocking everyone, really. I mean, after all, it's like, this parliament of all of these, intelligent, progressive, well-meaning Germans gets together and says, look, we really think Prussia should be the leader of Germany. There's a reason for that. I'll talk more about it in the second half of the lecture, but the idea that either Prussia or Austria would lead Germany. The nationalists and the liberals preferred Prussia. Again, not because Prussia was militaristic, that's the kind of modern reputation of the Prussians, but rather because Prussia was mono-ethnic and monolinguistic. It was German. Well, look, it was like 90% German. There was a Polish minority. Whereas Austria was multi-ethnic. That is, Austria stood for these older principles. So they basically say, look, we're going to get together. You can be emperor of a new unified German emperor with, you'll be a kind of a parliamentary emperor, but, you'll be the emperor of basically the greatest power in Europe. And he says no. So the Prussians, too, they stand for reaction. Now, it's interesting and perhaps not accidental that many of those who were fleeing the Russian troops, the Polish and Hungarian refugees of the suppression of this rebellion, fleeing the Russian troops, fleeing the Habsburgs, they actually go to the Ottoman Empire, particularly Constantinople, the capital, where they are granted asylum. Now, this, again, this kind of like puts its stamp on this new reputation of the Tanzimat era that the Ottoman Empire now stands for liberalism. It wasn't all humbug. I mean, the Ottomans, they also had a very liberal trade policy, which, again, in some ways was probably benefiting the Western powers more than the Ottomans, because not only the capitulations, but also very low tariffs in that period. There were other liberal principles, too. But suddenly, and not necessarily for the last time, but for the last time in a while, the Ottomans now emerge again as this great cause in kind of liberal Western Europe. Particularly in Britain. I mean, in France, it's hard to know how serious this was because the press was state-controlled. But in Britain, the newspapers literally begin sort of touting the whole Ottoman cause. That Turkey is now standing for kind of progress and liberalism. And the Russians are now really the primary antagonists for Britain. I haven't talked about the Great Game much. We'll look at that next week. But in terms of kind of global geopolitical rivalry and intrigue, it mostly has to do with Central Asia and the routes to India. Britain now sees Russia as its primary antagonist and enemy. And so maybe it was inevitable that the Ottomans would emerge as a kind of British client state at this time. But that is what is basically happening. Now, all of this wouldn't necessarily have led to war. Certainly the British, I don't think, would have had any enthusiasm for a war like this, unless Napoleon III had provoked the crisis. So it goes something like this. I think it's a little bit mixed on both boards here. It's a little bit confusing because France did have an old claim. I think it dated back to 1740, a capitulation which actually did relate to Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire. Some of it went back even longer than that. It went back to the Crusades, the establishment of a lot of these kind of Crusader kingdoms. Because the Crusades have been largely, although not exclusively French-inspired, and many of the kind of the great knights and leaders who went there were French, France also had a kind of sentimental come religious attachment to the Christians of the Levant. This was particularly true of the Maronites in Lebanon, right up to really the First World War in the 20th century, and even today's Lebanon, France still has a kind of a cultural line or influence or claim on the territories. So there was something to it. Napoleon basically just said, look, I want you to name me formally, and he asked the Sultan, protector of the Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire. There was something there, but obviously the whole thing was kind of like, it was like tossing a grenade, into, maybe not a grenade, but you say fuel on the fire. He knew that something was going to happen here. Probably he was trying to provoke the Russians. There doesn't seem to be much doubt about that. Why? Well, because the Russians themselves, of course, had this claim. Now, the confusing part is, if you go back to Küçük Kaynarca, we know the basics of the treaty. The Russians were not only gaining territories, very soon after this, they annexed the Crimea. There was a certain clause which had to do with a kind of right of intervention, or right, as it was called, to make representation on behalf of, here's where it gets interesting. The Russians claim, and many of them think, that they had the right to make representation on behalf of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. That's not what the treaty actually said. The treaty actually spoke of just one church, which hadn't even been built yet, in fact. A church to be built in Constantinople, in the capital, and Russia would have the right to, quote-unquote, make interventions or representation on behalf of that church. Now, the thing about these treaties is that they take on a life of their own. The idea, in fact, the idea which even persists widely today, that the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca gave the Russians these broad rights to kind of intervene or protect or make representations on behalf of Ottoman Christians, was something probably even a lot of people in the Ottoman Empire thought the treaty said. It didn't actually say that. Now, the Tsar himself, Nicholas I, it's an open question how much he himself knew about what the treaty said. After all, this was the job of his diplomats to tell him. And he seems to have been misinformed. The foreign minister at the time was Count Nesselrode. Now, Count Nesselrode probably knew better, or he might not have known better. I'm really not sure. But he gave the Tsar the idea that what Napoleon III was demanding was not simply a kind of symbolic affront to Russia's claims in the Ottoman Empire, but that it specifically violated these parts of the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, that is, that it really was as if the Ottoman Empire had gone back on its legal obligations. So they send this thing, they call it the Menshikov mission. I think I wrote that up here. The Menshikov mission was definitely sent to intimidate the Ottoman Empire. There's no doubt about that, because they chose not a diplomat, they actually chose a military man. He was, of course, he was a count, he was an aristocrat just like Nesselrode, but his background was military. And so he went in full dress uniform, and he very much kind of conducted himself, almost so as to insult the Ottomans. The idea of demanding their adherence to this old treaty, demanding that they grant Russia the formal right to make representations on behalf of Christians, that it be issued in a kind of formal imperial firman, etc., etc. Now here's where things get a little bit confusing. The Russians themselves were probably, again, misinformed about the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. The Ottomans didn't actually seem to be any better informed about the actual terms of the treaty. However, they made it clear that they were not about to back down in the face of this kind of Russian threat. It was kind of a pseudo-threat, because the Ottomans by this point begin to think that they have Britain and France on their side. Slowly, yes, the British and the French, they do dispatch warships to the Ottoman Empire to kind of buttress the confidence of the Ottoman officials. Also, Stratford de Canning is appointed ambassador, and he himself is so viciously anti-Russian. This is almost like Britain, although it's confusing because his orders were actually to defuse the crisis and prevent war. But in those days, ambassadors were almost like free agents. Communications were so slow that he pretty much disobeyed all of his orders from London and encouraged the Ottomans to stand firm. The Russians actually, not a lot of people know this, the Russians actually backed down. They backed down on nearly all of their demands, to the point where they send Menshikov in February, to the point where by May, they're only asking for the vaguest statement of, respecting Russia's kind of traditional rights to have some kind of relations with the Ottoman subjects. They back down on almost all points, but the Ottomans refuse. The Russians then send troops into what were called the Principalities, that is Wallachia and Moldavia, what is now modern Romania. It's confusing. Technically it's Ottoman territory, but the Russians have really been administering it for decades. And so the Russians are sending troops kind of into their own territory, but it's meant as a kind of ultimatum or a threat. Well, the Ottomans obviously do not back down, as we know. They stand firm through the whole summer. Yeah, there are even kind of these holy war demonstrations in August. They're being encouraged to the hilt by the British and the French. The British press is starting to get involved. Now all of this kind of comes together. And the key date to me was the 28th of September 1853. The thing to remember here is very simple. The Ottomans declared war, not the Russians. In some ways you can see this as parallel in reverse to what happens in 1914. when the Russians actually mobilized first. That is in the First World War. The thing that's interesting is that in both cases, the Ottomans were the ones who were more eager for war, just as I think the Russians were in 1914, because they had Britain and France on their side. So here's the thing. The Ottomans, remember, have fought a lot of wars against the Russians going back centuries, and they've lost nearly all of them, right? So here really is a chance for revenge. It's a chance to fight another war with Russia under more favorable conditions. That is, with Britain and France on the Ottoman side. The Russians, incidentally, do not actually declare war until the 2nd of November. In other words, the Russians spent a whole month waiting. They did not really want the war, for the very good reason that they did not want to have to fight Britain and France. Now, the rest, to a certain extent, is history. What happens in early November after the Russians declare war is quite famous. Everyone knows about Sinop, right? The Russians essentially destroyed the Ottoman fleet and set fire to much of the city. It's not usually conceded, though, necessarily, that the Russians did this in part because the Ottoman Navy actually went right up to the Russian ports and did kind of like what we'd say in modern terms was like a flyby, only with ships. So I suppose you'd call it like a swim-by or a sail-by. They were taunting the Russians, basically, saying, like, why don't you come out and attack? The Russians fell for the bait, in the same way that you might say Nicholas I had fallen for the bait of Napoleon III in getting involved in this stupid crisis to begin with. It's curious, because although Nicholas I, he definitely stood for reaction. He definitely was, shall we say, an autocrat, and he was definitely no pacifist. I mean, they fought these brutal wars in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, famously against Shamil and the mountain warriors in the Caucasus. But I don't think he was fundamentally an expansionist. I know that's not the usual interpretation of the Crimean War, but he did not want to fight the war, and I think he particularly did not want, again, this is unusual for Russians, he actually did not want to take Constantinople. This is not true of many other czars. But Nicholas I think, was baited into a war essentially he did not want to fight. Now, the basic story of the war is pretty well known. The Russians essentially win in the Caucasus. They take Kars. They lose in Sevastopol, that is in the Crimean Peninsula. The British and the French and the Ottomans send troops. They lay siege to the great fortress there. We know certain things about sanitation, poor sanitary conditions. Famously, Florence Nightingale improves, medical treatments. Most people in Britain remember the war mostly for Florence Nightingale. The results are really confusing because the Russians pretty much lose. But on the other hand, like if you look at the Firman of 1856 issued in February, the Russians, in a way, are able to consider this a victory because it explicitly essentially declares that Christians now have equal rights. And so the Russians actually say, oh, okay, then we won, because that's what we were fighting about. Which isn't obviously actually true, because the Russians had to give back Kars, and they had to give up certain territory in the Balkans, just a little bit of Bessarabia. The Russians were also forbidden the right to launch warships in the Black Sea, although so were the Ottomans. So it's sort of a wash in a way. Now, for the Ottomans, there was one fringe benefit of the war, a symbolic one, possibly an important one. They were invited, of course, as a belligerent to the Treaty of Paris, and in that sense symbolically accepted into the concert of Europe, which, remember, had not been true in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna. So, one result of the war is that the Ottomans enter this thing called the Concert of Europe. They are now, to a certain extent, admitted into the European system of diplomacy, public meetings, with all the rights and privileges attaining thereto, etc., etc. However, it would be very easy to argue that this was a hollow triumph because the Concert of Europe had essentially been blown up by the war. That is, it was no longer as important as it was before. The primary reason for this is that as the Russians were fighting a war against the Ottomans, the British, and the French, their own putative ally, that is the Austrians, issued an ultimatum to Russia to withdraw their troops from Romania. That is, the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. There were a number of reasons for this. The Austrian policy, basically laid out by Metternich's successor, Count Buol, was frankly rather short-sighted. But they seemed to think that they could get something out of the war by taking the side of Britain and France, even while not actually fighting. They were also concerned, of course, that the war would give Russia an excuse to push into the Balkans, which, yes, would threaten Austrian interests. Now, later on, the rivalry between Austria and Russia in the Balkans is really one of the primary causes, if not the primary cause, of at least the proximate cause of the outbreak of World War I. But remember that in 1848-49, the issue of Austrian interests versus Russian interests had been seen as irrelevant. They both supposedly, again, had this common interest in the Metternich system of simply suppressing revolution. That's why the Russians had sent troops. So that from the Russian perspective, this Austrian ultimatum, even if it kind of made sense what the Austrians were doing, you know, they didn't want Russian troops in their backyard. They also probably thought Russia was going to lose the war, and so they wanted to side with the winners, Britain and France. Essentially, this drove a stake through the heart of the old alliance in the Metternich system. Or, to use a different metaphor, they stabbed the Russians in the back, right after Russia had just sent its own troops to bail out the Austrians in 1848 and 49. In fact, there's an interesting postscript to this. The Tsar himself, our own Professor Norman Stone actually tells this story in an interesting way. He says when Nicholas I died, I think it was in March 1855, when he died, basically he went out to give a speech. He was already suffering from a cold, and he didn't put on a jacket. And it was like this freezing speech in the rain, and he later died of pneumonia. The way Norman puts it, he died of a broken heart. That's maybe like a little bit of an exaggeration. But he definitely had his kind of whole point of his existence, to a certain extent, undermined, if not broken, by the Austrians. So there are a couple of results from the Crimean War. If we look at the upshot, this is a war, remember, which was, even though the Ottomans declared the war and the Russians fell for the bait, in a sense the whole thing had been cooked up by Napoleon III, by the French emperor. So he gets what he wants, right? You could say Napoleon III wins. Why? Because he split Austria from Russia, which was kind of the whole point. In a sense, whatever happened with the Ottomans was kind of beside the point for France. France basically wanted to break up the concert system. Yes, the Ottomans are now brought into the Congress system, but it no longer really matters, because the whole point of the thing, the upholding of legitimacy, concert as monarchs would meet together to adjudicate disputes according to principles of legitimacy, that is now dead. Done, gone. Okay, so Austria is split from Russia. The concert is dead. Now that also means its principles are dead. That is, the principle of legitimacy is essentially gone. It's not that it didn't exist, it's that there was no consensus about enforcing it. So that in a way, this opens, you might call it, it opens the floodgates, as we call it sometimes in English, meaning it's kind of like, you know, the water is being held back and now the water starts flowing out. Great waterfall of, essentially, nationalism. Because the thing about the Metternich system, as Napoleon III maybe grasped, he may not have understood the full implications, was how fragile it was. It nearly broke apart in 1848. It only held together then because Austria and Russia and Prussia had all essentially teamed up on the principle of legitimacy to suppress popular sovereignty, liberalism, nationalism, etc. Well, now there was no trust left. No trust between Austria and Russia. Even to a certain extent, the Prussians had kind of sat out the Crimean War. But on the other hand, they were not necessarily, at least Bismarck was not necessarily too terribly disturbed about the fact that Austria had essentially failed. The Austrians thought they had succeeded because they did get Russia to withdraw troops from Romania, which is exactly what they supposedly wanted. But it didn't really help Austria in the long run, because Austria's real interests weren't holding on to its empire, particularly in Italy. And Napoleon III, who is if there was any winner in the Crimean War, it was him. You know, his prestige is not very high. He's the one who concocted the whole thing. You know, France is on the winning side. Well, he all along has been this romantic proponent of Italian nationalism, right? And so the Austrians, by supporting him, I think what they basically wanted was for him to promise not to meddle in Italy. But he never actually promised them that. Now, the Austrians sacrificed their alliance with Russia for nothing, basically. They thought they would get together at this Congress and the French would kind of make some promises. They would agree to uphold some new system, but they never did that. France had no real interest in preserving Austria, particularly because Napoleon III, I mean, he hates the Austrians. The Austrians are the ones who stand for everything that supposedly he is against. So he hates them. He doesn't care. He's grateful that they stabbed the Russians in the back, but that's okay. Gratitude, it doesn't matter. Gratitude grates. So within a couple of years, by 1859, you have nearly the coup de grace to the old system. Romanian independence is proclaimed. And then you have a literal war between France and Austria over Italy. Or as the alliance has it, it's Piedmont and France against Austria. This is where Napoleon III shows his true colors. He basically encourages Piedmont Count Cavour, the architect of the kind of anti-Austrian alliance, to declare war on the Austrians. I know we're almost to the end of the first war, the first hour. I'll just briefly go into the war, because the war itself is not really all that interesting. What is interesting, a couple of things. Napoleon III, again, part of it is a romantic attachment to Italy and the Italian nationalist movement. He had many friends in the movement. Part of it is this vague notion that France wants to, again, just change things, pretty much. Part of it is territorial. Like what we think of today as the French Riviera, Nice, Monte Carlo, all of that was still part of Austrian Italy. And so France actually does gain, the provinces of Savoy and Nice. So they do gain territory. And they do help Italy become independent against Austria. The Austrians obviously lose. But Napoleon, a couple of things go wrong. Now, one is that because he's worried about the Catholic vote in France, he decides not to make the capital in Rome, but instead in Florence. Maybe I have that backwards. Anyway, he's also worried in part because he doesn't want Italian independence to go too far. He wants it to be only northern Italy, and so he actually cuts a separate peace with Austria, trying to end the war. But the Italians don't like that because they want to unify all of Italy. And so France gains territory, but at the expense of kind of alarming the other powers. Britain in particular is frightened now of what Napoleon III is doing. So he's ruined his alliance with Britain that goes back to the Crimean War. He has now really pissed off the Austrians, and he's beginning to alarm even the other powers. France gains a little bit of territory, but at the price of, again, completely ending Austrian influence in Italy, alarming the British, and putting the Prussians on high alert. The ultimate upshot of all of this is that he creates the monster which French foreign policy had spent the last 200 or 300 years trying to prevent, which is the monster of German unification. But I'll talk about that after the break. Let's take about 10 minutes, and then we will pick up with Bismarck. It was actually that he was willing to work with France. But before we get to Bismarck, we have to go back a little bit into French history, because at least in the 1850s up to the Crimean War and the Italian War of Unification, France is, in a sense, the leading power, at least the power which is still influencing events the most, even if not necessarily the most powerful country in Europe. Remember that France had recovered, in many ways, probably more than it deserved to, after the wars of Napoleon, restoring the borders of 1789, the status quo ante, even really going back and almost restoring the old regime, the Bourbons. I've included here what I hope is kind of a useful list of French governments. The French go through governments so frequently that they have different ways of referring to them. In fact, I think modern French people probably remember most of these governments in terms of furniture and art. Like you say, this armoire was a Second Empire. This one was not necessarily First Republic, because that didn't last very long. But you'd refer to something as a Second Republic or a Second Empire or Third Republic item. You can see they've gone through a lot. We remember the Bourbons going back to 1850. Then you have about 15 years of a restoration of the old regime. Again, to set back the clock. That was the reason France got a pretty good deal, got its old borders. France was not completely truncated or occupied in any permanent way. But this, of course, then is torn asunder in the July Revolution of 1830, leading to the so-called July, or it's sometimes called the bourgeois, or the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe, who was kind of a progressive in some ways, but the restrictions on the voting franchise were still very severe. Sometimes people call this almost a government by oligarchy, that is, by the wealthy merchant classes along with the aristocrats who had recovered their positions somewhat. Now this gives way to a new phase of revolutions which begins in Paris in 1848. Again, the dates are a little imprecise. Technically, you could say the Second Republic lasts until about December of 1851, when this kind of coup d'etat is staged by Napoleon III. And then this leads to the government we refer to as the Second Empire, that of Napoleon III, between roughly 18... I could give scores to those who I've graded, but it's unfair to those whose exams I have not graded. And so please do come Friday. Okay, now we're going to ease back into the subject today. We have a couple of things to cover. Loosely speaking, the first half of the lecture I'm going to talk mostly about Napoleon III and the French. Let's try to listen. If there's a question about something I've written, please ask. Is there a question?
Yes, first time as tragedy?
First time as tragedy, second as farce. This is a famous aphorism of Karl Marx, which relates to the events I'm going to talk about. So if we look here, let's try to listen. Again, the first half of the lecture I'm going to talk mostly about the French and Napoleon III, and the second half we're going to cover Bismarck, Prussia, and the rise of Germany. In some ways, the themes all come together. They were kind of, they were antagonists in a way, although early on, they weren't necessarily averse to working with one another. In fact, ironically, Bismarck, who will later be the one who essentially destroys Napoleon III and humiliates France, part of his innovation in the 1850s was to Henry IV, Paris is worth a mass, religious toleration. Then the golden era of kind of absolutism under the Sun King. Finally, of course, the Revolution, which technically did not really end the Bourbon monarchy. For a couple of years, remember, Louis XVI was still on the throne. Then you had the First Republic, the kind of Second French Revolution, year zero, the metric system, all the rest, the terror, the National Convention. Now, I put a couple of dates here because, again, depending on how pedantic or semantic you want to be, you could say that Napoleon really became dictator in 1799, even though he didn't declare himself emperor until 1804. So that the First Republic you could date either for these 7 years or maybe these 12 years. Technically, 12 years might make more sense because that is the length of time they used the new calendar for, with all of the new months and so on. Then, of course, you had the First Empire, or you might just call it simply the Napoleonic era, the high Napoleonic era, until, I suppose, again, you could date it to 1814, when they lost the wars and they inaugurated the Congress of Vienna, except remember there was also the 100 Days in 1815. So to simplify things, you could say right up to 18. Okay, not a bad turnout for the first day after the Bayram. Does anyone care about anything other than exam scores here? I mean, does anyone want to learn about history, or is it just, exam scores? Listen, I understand you want your exam scores. I'm doing my best. I haven't finished them. There are 43 exams, okay? It's a lot to grade. I have 85 students. I've been out of the country for most of the last 10 days. I had to come back from Los Angeles. I left Los Angeles, I know it's tough, but I left Los Angeles at 5 a.m. on Sunday, and I got back yesterday. So you can imagine I'm a little exhausted from my trip. I'm doing my best. I've graded maybe 30 exams. Those of you who were kind enough to attend class the week after the midterm already know your exam scores. The rest of you will have to wait until Friday, unless that is you were clever or lucky enough to cop a peek at the scores. Really,